Hi, I'm Rob, and I'd like to welcome you to this video where we'll build a full stack RAG app with Amazon Bedrock. We'll create a knowledge base backed by S3 vectors, not OpenSearch, connect an S3 bucket for our source docs, use Titan for embeddings and S3 vectors as the vector store, as mentioned, and we'll deploy a Lambda function behind an API gateway and a React front end that talks to it and deploy it in an S3 bucket so it all runs on AWS. Now, if you watched the last two videos in a playlist, this may sound familiar, but there are a few key differences I want to call out. First, in Module 4, we used OpenSearch Serverless as the vector store in Bedrock. And in Module 5, we added a local Streamlit and Fast API app on top of that same backend. In this video, Module 6, we switch from the OpenSearch Serverless vector store to S3 vectors, and we bundle everything into a single stack. No dependency on modules 4 or 5, and it runs at a much lower cost on AWS. Now, to get started, I want to take a quick look at the README, and specifically the prereq section. Here you see you obviously need an AWS account, the AWS CLI installed and configured, and I'm using US East 1, the AWS CDK for TypeScript CLI, and Node.js and NPM for the CDK and the React front end. Now we can get started with deploying the AWS infrastructure. And for this you have two options: manual deployment via the console or using the CDK code I've provided. If you're going to use the manual option, I've also provided a step-by-step manual deployment markdown file you can follow. For this deployment, I'm going to use the CDK. And if you're going to follow along with this, you'll need Node.js and NPM installed. If you don't have them, you can either go to nodejs.org and download the appropriate version for your operating system, or I'll provide a link to a video I have on how to install Node and NPM on a Mac in the description below. And you'll need the AWS CDK for TypeScript installed, which you can get using this command. Now let's look at the CDK code. Okay, so starting on the left with the CDK JSON file. This tells the CDK CLI how to run the app. The app key points to the entry point, which is npx tsnode prefer TypeScript extensions, and the app.ts file in the source folder. So when you run CDK deploy or CDK synth, the CDK executes the app TypeScript file. And this is the CDK app entry point. It creates the app and instantiates the stack. And the stack it instantiates is the RAG S3 vector stack in US East 1. Now, looking at the RAG stack TypeScript file, it defines the single stack and wires the two main pieces together. The first being the knowledge base construct, which has the docs bucket, S3 vectors, Bedrock knowledge base, and the data source. And we provide a path to the document corpus in the doc assets path, which is pointing to the assets folder in the for Bedrock RAG knowledge base project. It also defines the Lambda API construct, which has a Lambda role, a Lambda function, and HTTP API. It needs the knowledge base ID from the first construct and a path to the Lambda code, which is in the Lambda folder. The outputs from the RAG stack expose the API URL, the knowledge base ID, and the docs bucket name for use after deployment. The knowledge base TypeScript file has all the infrastructure for the Bedrock knowledge base backed by S3 vectors. So it creates the S3 docs bucket, the S3 vector bucket, the IAM role for Bedrock, and the CFN knowledge base and data source. So here we see we're setting the region, which as we recall was US East 1, and we're providing the ARN of the embedding model, which is Titan embed text v2o. And then we have the construct for the docs bucket, with a removal policy set to destroy and auto delete objects set to true. Now we have the variables for the S3 vector bucket and the vector index, passing it the vector index name and Titan embed dimensions, which if we scroll back up, we see we've defined above. Here we have the knowledge base IAM role and policies. Then the Bedrock knowledge base. We're giving it a name, setting the role ARN to the role ARN of the knowledge base role, the configuration type to vector, and passing the embedding model arn as the value for the vector knowledge base configuration. The storage config uses S3 vectors. We're passing the vector bucket arn attribute from the vector bucket. The vector index is index arn, and the vector index name. The knowledge base has dependencies on the knowledge base role and the vector index. Here we're defining the bucket for the data source, and we see that this construct exposes the knowledge base ID, data source ID, and docs bucket name. And finally, we have the Lambda API TypeScript file, which is the API layer, including Lambda and an HTTP API for posting to the chat endpoint. Again, we're setting the region, and we're passing the ARN for the foundation model, which is Claude 3 Haiku. We're creating a Lambda execution role with policies for the Bedrock knowledge base, and granting Bedrock invoke model access to the foundation model ARN. Here, we're defining the Lambda function, setting environment variables for the knowledge base ID and foundation model ARN, which were exported from the RAG stack and knowledge base construct. And finally, we have a construct for the API gateway HTTP API with a route to the chat endpoint. Now, with the code walkthrough done, let's jump into a terminal and deploy the infrastructure. So to get started, we'll open a terminal in a CDK folder and do an npm install to install the dependencies. Next, you'll want to run the CDK bootstrap command with your account ID and your region. Then you could run CDK deploy to deploy the stack. Say yes to accept the changes. And if we jump into CloudFormation, we see the status for our stack is create in progress. Now we see the status is create complete, and if we go to our outputs, we see the API URL that we'll need to put into our frontend apps.env file. So go ahead and copy this off and save it for later. Now let's jump into Bedrock, go into knowledge bases, select our knowledge base and the data source, and then sync. Now let's just do a quick test of the knowledge base. Select a model. We'll go with Anthropic Claude Sonnet 4. And ask, what is AI Agent Ensure? And we see the response, so that looks good. Now with the AWS services deployed, let's turn our attention to the front-end React app. If you look in the front-end folder, you'll see the app is already built out for you. And in the README, there's instructions on how to build and deploy the app. But also in the front-end folder, there's a Getting Started Markdown file that will walk you through building this app step by step. And that's what we're going to do now. But if you don't want to build the app from scratch, you have the option of just using the code that's provided. So I'm in a new project folder with a copy of the Getting Started Markdown file. And if we look at the prereqs, you'll see you need Node.js, npm, and the API URL from API Gateway. Now, to get started, I'll create a front-end directory and change into it. Then run this command to scaffold and launch the React app. And that looks good, so I'll go ahead and terminate that run command. We already have the default dependencies installed, so we can skip this npm step, then scroll down and install some additional dependencies. So just a quick note here that if you ran into an error running the npx command, you can manually create the tailwind.config.js file and populate it with this placeholder code. But we're going to put the actual code we need in that file in the next step. So let's copy paste that code. We'll come back and walk through the most important parts of this React code after we complete the build. So let's just keep moving forward for now. Next, we'll open the index.css file in the source folder and replace the contents with the code here. Then continue to follow the steps in the Markdown file through the end. I'll pick up the speed through this process, then meet you when the UI is launched and look at the code. Okay, I hope that went well for you. If not, leave me a comment with the step you had an issue with below, and I'll try and help troubleshoot. Okay, now in the .env file in the front end folder, you want to replace your vAPI URL with the URL from your CDK output. Now we'll go ahead and save the file, and in a terminal in the front end folder, we'll execute npm run dev, and then load the React app on localhost 3000 in our browser. And we'll ask our first question. And we see the response with sources retrieved from the knowledge base. Now let's ask another question. And we see that response as well. We'll ask one more. And now we'll ask a question that isn't in the knowledge base. And we see an appropriate response from the model. Okay, with the app working properly, let's go back and look at some of the React code. Starting on the left, we'll look at the index.html file, which is the entry point into the UI. Here we see it's importing a JavaScript module in the source folder called main.tsx. And if you look at main, we see it has an element for app, which is imported from app.tsx. And app exports the default app function, which contains the main implementation for the React application. So here we see a couple functions. The first is handle submit, which takes a query and passes it to the ask question function, which is in the API TypeScript file in the services folder. So if we look at the API TypeScript file, we see the ask question function, which takes the query and returns a query response promise. And that query response is defined in the types file. And if we look at that, we see the query response interface, which has a query, a generated response from the model, and the S3 locations, as well as an interface for a query error. Now, back in the app.tsx file, we see when askQuestion is invoked, it'll fetch from the API URL, which is populated in the .env file, sending the method as a post, the header content type is application JSON, and for the body, a stringified payload object. It will await the response in JSON and store that in the data variable. Then if the response is okay, it'll return the data as a query response back to the app.tsx. There's also a handle example select function, which takes a sample prompt and sends it to the handle submit function. The main body of the page is wrapped in this return, where here you'll see the HTML elements and event handlers like the handle submit function and the onClick function of this button. Here, when the page loads, we see where the example prompts are displayed, which are imported from example prompts in the components folder, which we see here. So that's a quick walkthrough of the React UI. Now we're at the final step in the video, and that's to build and deploy the front end to an S3 web hosting bucket. And you can either do that manually or run the deploy shell script I have in the front end folder. If you're going to use the script, be sure to go back and populate the region and the bucket variables in the .env file. Then in the terminal, go ahead and run the deploy shell script. Then we can open the website URL in the browser and test the app again. And that seems to be working fine with the front end served from the S3 bucket. Now, before we wrap up, back in the terminal in the front end folder, I'll run a command to force destroy the S3 bucket. Then jump back into the terminal in the CDK folder and run CDK destroy to tear down the stack. And it brings us to the conclusion of the video. If you found it useful, feel free to give it a like. And if you'd like to be notified when I add more content to the channel, please consider subscribing. Thanks for watching.